Ok, sean bienvenidos. Vamos a probar el juego de Dear Esther. Vamos a ver, es la primera vez, no sé de qué trata. Así de que vamos a ver de qué trata el juego. Que nada más que estoy configurando todo. Así de que vamos a ver sonido. Opciones, audio, wow, se está funcionando. Pues vamos a ver. Controles. No sé, vamos a ver de qué trata. ¿De qué se trata esto? Díganme si se escucha bien el audio del juego, porque pues no sé cómo está. Y como me gustan los juegos de historia, pues vamos a ver qué trae. Tomando plato.
Hello everyone, I'm Dan Pinchbeck, I'm the creative director of the Chinese Room, and this is the Dear Esther developers commentary.
Hi, I'm Robert Briscoe, I'm the artist on Dear Esther.
And I'm Jessica Curry, and I was the composer on the game.
So what you're looking at today is a remake of a mod. Dear Esther started off in 2007 as a Half-Life 2 mod that did really, really well in the modding community, which was fantastic, and as a result of that attracted the attention of Rob, who worked as the primary developer on a source.
So you'll see around you in a lot of the environments, there's a lot of detail ingrained into everything. One of the things that I wanted to do with Dear Esther is bring the visuals up to the same kind of level of detail that Dan and Jess had put into the other areas of the game. So all of the history and the kind of hidden pieces of story that are intertwined with the VOs and the music and stuff, I kind of wanted to bring some of that into the environments. So if you look around you, you'll see that there's a lot of interesting bits and pieces, a piece of paper with someone's name on it, a photograph, an ultrasound. All of these little bits and pieces are kind of laid in to just kind of bring another aspect of the story into the game. And also, they're actually randomized, so every time you play, you'll see something different lying around. And this is just to build on this idea that everybody has a unique experience and a unique interpretation of the story. So you'll see around you in a lot of the environments, there's a lot of detail ingrained into everything. One of the things that I wanted to do with Dear Esther is bring the visuals up to the same kind of level of detail that Dan and Jess had put into the other areas of the game. So all of the history and the kind of hidden pieces of story that are intertwined with the VOs and the music and stuff, I kind of wanted to bring some of that into the environments. So if you look around you, you'll see that there's a lot of interesting bits and pieces, a piece of paper with someone's name on it, a photograph, an ultrasound. All of these little bits and pieces are kind of laid in to just kind of bring another aspect of the story into the game, and also they're actually randomized, so every time you play you'll see something different lying around. And this is just to build on this idea that everybody has a unique experience and a unique interpretation of the story.
Pues por ahorita me ha gustado los gráficos. Y pues de lo que, si me entendieron, se trata de que están contando de dónde sacaron la historia, cómo es que la hicieron, de dónde sacaron la información y todo eso.
Part of the point about the whole game, I think, was this idea that rather than having a linear, straight-through version of the story, that we could have multiple story units for each place you were, and I was really interested in this idea of how you can open up that space that people can interpret. So I loved the idea that you could have two people that had played this game and then would have a conversation about it, and one of them would say, oh, what did you think about when this happened? And the other person would be like, well, that didn't happen for me. I had a completely different event happen or a completely different story happen. And it kind of feels very gamey in that way, that actually one of the things I love about writing for games is that you hand over so much control to the player that it becomes their story, and that's really, really important rather than trying to force them. So using randomised blocks of voiceover in the game and the kind of randomised prop details that Rob was talking about means that it gives it a really different feeling every time you go through. And that's kind of interesting for me, because I like the idea of going...
When I wrote the music for the mod of Dear Esther, there was absolutely no budget whatsoever for live players, so all the music was sampled. But one of the good things about that is it actually forced me to be quite creative about how I wrote the music. So with my background in sound art, I wanted to use samples in a different way that wasn't just using it to sound like a...
Everything about Esther for me is a dream. The landscape is not an island, it's the dream of an island. The music is like music that you wake up because you've heard in your sleep, but you're not conscious of hearing it. And the language in the story was supposed to be like that as well. It didn't matter the sense it made, it was more about the kind of the shapes it created, if that makes sense. So that the words would kind of were like being in water, like listening to something underwater. It'd be this very dreamlike, symbolic, poetic thing. And it always frustrated me in games with game writing. This has really changed quite a lot. There was never any space for poetic language. It was very exposition-y, very descriptive, very direct. And you'd have like art and audio would have these amazing creative spaces they could explore. But when it came down to actually writing, you just had to basically go into the room, describe the character, tell the player what to do. And it just seemed like the most boring thing you could do with words in a game. And why couldn't a writer have the same artistic freedom as a visual artist or an audio designer or a musician, in terms of being able to say, isn't this just about creating this kind of emotional tone, this emotional space? And it's really, I still love that about the game, and it's one of the things I love so much about Nigel's voiceover, is it has this really odd, disconnected, kind of dreamlike quality to it, where you might finish the game and not actually understand anything that happened, but you'd been carried along in the flow of it. And without any kind of sarcasm at all, I get into trouble saying things like this. The same design... So people have asked why the Dear Esther's set on a Hebridean island. What's really interesting about this is it's one of those times when your kind of aspirations as an artist and the practical realities kind of dovetail. We knew that we had to have some way of limiting the player from disappearing off the play space, and when we made the original, it was a mod, and because it was a Half-Life 2 mod, you kind of had Eastern European city, spaceship, or blasted, desolate landscape, where you had three options if you didn't want to start making any other assets. So it started off with these practical constraints. We don't want to set it on a spaceship, we don't want to set it in an Eastern European city, so it's got to be on this kind of like this desolate landscape. And we want to limit the player, so an island seems like a natural choice. And it's really interesting how you start from that, and we had this big lump of clay on a table that we were carving out paths and things to annoying the cleaners and things like that. And Jess and I were talking, and Jess started...
One of the things you're always trying to do as a composer is create memorable themes. And a slight confession is that probably the most memorable theme, which is Remember in Dear Esther, wasn't actually created for the game. Rob's looking shocked. So it was actually from a piece of choral music that I'd written years before, based on a Christina Rossetti poem called Remember. And one of the things I was talking about earlier was how I didn't have any budget. So I had this piece of choral music, and I thought, hang on, this is absolutely perfect for Esther. But I don't want to use all of it. So the only bit that you actually get in the game is the first line of the choral piece of music. But that actually went on to form the main theme of the music that I wrote. And I think for me it's really interesting about how things that you've written earlier, years before, sometimes come in really, really useful and fit. So I always tell people and students not to despair if something doesn't get used.
White lines.
Yeah.
They actually did this. It was really cool. I found this historical document. They used to do this on Bora and the Hebrides. If their disease broke out,
Really?
they'd actually chip out and expose the chalk. So if you're on a boat and you were coming to the island, you know not to land because it was infectious, which is the coolest, most amazing. It's one of those things where you go, it's almost impossible as a writer to come up with something as cool as that. It just has to be something that was actually done. And it's so sad as well. And I love this bit and the fact that we can do it because it feels really real because it references a real thing. And I don't know, there's something really special about that. But it was always one of those bits in the game that I thought, we've got to be able to represent this somehow. We have to be able to get these things in here.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I actually didn't know that was actually based historically in real life. But that's really cool. Because, I mean, my thing about the white lines is that it was kind of...
Hola, Felipe.
It was this completely surreal thing. But also, it was kind of... It just added to the landscape. It's like, whoa, what the hell is that?
Pues estamos empezando
putting
un
that
nuevo
into the
juego, se
game
llama Dear Esther.
was kind of challenging because to me it just seemed like, oh, it's going to be really hard to pull off in a way that's kind of realistic. But then when you look at the kind of art style of the game, it's not really a realistic thing. Like everything is half imagined. So in that way it kind of really fit into the landscape, and it kind of creates this amazing sort of landmark that you see in the environment, and I just found it really interesting to hear about that. Yeah.
I think it's one of those things where it's not a realistic place. And I mean, no game is a realistic place anyway, but one of those things where understanding that you're making something which isn't real and you have that kind of capacity to to explore it artistically. There's a scene in Donnie Darko where Drew Barrymore's playing his English teacher, and she talks about cellador as being the most beautiful word in the English language, and about it's the sound of the words together. And Dear Esther actually comes from the introduction from a Faith No More song, the Crab song on the first album, Introduce Yourself. And there's a point where
probando juego ya que
Chuck
terminé en Target, supuestamente
just says, Dear
yo no he visto
Esther,
reseñas
and it
de
really
él ni
lodged
nada,
with me because the
pero
sound
lo que
Dear
leí de
Esther just has a really amazing sound to it. And I think when we started making it,
de
and
historia,
the idea of it being
que
this series of letters to someone came through, it just came straight back out going,
ese tipo de
that's
juegos
just a
me gusta.
really beautiful sounding combination of words. And I think that really sums up the whole approach to the writing in Dear Esther of what's the most beautiful combination of words and images we can put together, and to do it that way rather than writing a traditional plot as such. So yeah, Dear Esther, Faith No More and Doom, that's where it comes from.
Lo que me ha gustado son los gráficos, están muy suaves los gráficos.
I think the central question to the entire experience for most people that have played it or are talking about it is this idea of, is the island real? Is what's going on a literal event of a man walking across a Scottish island, or is it a dream that he's had? Does the island even exist? And one of the things that we try to do with writing is to constantly lull the player into a position where they got an understanding, they made a decision about what they thought was going on, and then to undercut it. So you never actually were able to settle on any one interpretation. And that was the challenge I set myself when I wrote the original mod. Was, can we put a story in a game that not only lends itself to multiple interpretations, but there is no stable interpretation. Every single interpretation you have will always have questions, and you'll never be able to fully trust what you think you understand about the game. So it's challenging, I think, for that result. It becomes quite a challenging kind of game story because of that, because you don't ever get that situation to go, I understand it now, I can walk away from this thing and it's all closed off and it's tidy. It was a very deliberate attempt to say, no matter where you think you are with this story, you're always questioning whether or not that's right.
Sí. Están hablando de gráficos, están hablando de cómo fue que sacaron esta historia, los dibujos, y que pues supuestamente tratan de recuerdos y todo eso. ¿Acaso me perdí? Porque este es por donde yo entré. ¿O esta es otra salida? Sí, yo ya entré por aquí, entonces pues vamos a ver. Sí, de eso tratan. Todo lo que han estado hablando es cómo fue que hicieron, de dónde sacaron la historia, y todo eso, pero yo hasta ahorita pues voy empezando y lo quería probar junto con ustedes. Así de que pues vamos a ver. Pero ya me quedé aquí atorada. Supuestamente tengo que ponerme a rebuscar en todo lo que hay. Y pues por ahí entré. A ver. Ok. Pues vamos a ver si por algún lugar está. Pero no corre, no golpea, no hace nada, no entiendo todavía. Ahora sí que me perdí, señor Felipe, ¿por qué? ¿Qué dije? Ah, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Felipe. Pero Felipe es torcito, ok, ya entiendo. Pues en sí, como le digo, no. Oh, 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 oh. Pero ¿por qué te ahogas?
Come back.
Ok, al parecer ya va a empezar la historia. Dice, tienes que regresar. Pues vamos a ver a dónde tengo que regresar. Muchas gracias. En sí es A mí lo que me interesa es que les guste el contenido, que se entretengan, yo no sé si lo estoy haciendo bien o no, pero a mí lo único que me interesa es divertirme y divertirlos. Eso es lo único. Vamos a ver qué es lo que nos dice ahora. Ok, quiere decir que me equivoqué. Ahí está.
One of the things that's been most commented on with the audio and the music in Dear Esther is how sparse it is. And that was a really deliberate tactic. I wanted to leave room for the player to think and to dream and to wonder and to put their own interpretation into what was happening. And I think the problem with so much modern media is how bombarded we are constantly. It's the kind of MTV, flash in your face, constant music. And Dan and I watch a lot of drama together, and there really is constant
Endless,
music.
which is constantly telling you what you should feel, like really clearly, and it's like being kind of beaten up by the music sometimes.
And when you read a lot of reviews of Dear Esther, a lot of people say they had this time to think and to interpret, and that was one of their favourite things, that they placed themselves so directly into the game and it's their experience. And I think that's actually the greatest success of the game on all points, from the story to Rob's art to the music, is we all left space for the player to dream.
Wow.
So there's a lot of places in the game where you see a lot of strange things, and this is very deliberate. One of the things we wanted to do is just kind of like not spoon feed the player every little piece of story. We kind of just, some things are literally just in there to just kind of let you think and let you decide on whatever you want to bring to the story yourself. It's kind of like I approached it like an impressionist painting, where you've got like this kind of very vague outline of things, but if you stare at it enough, you can kind of like fill in the spaces, and kind of the image comes together on its own. So a lot of these kind of strange pieces of geography and stuff, that's really kind of deliberate in some ways, just to kind of keep the player's mind open and kind of bring their own interpretations of the story through that.
Wow. Interesante. Muy interesante. Santo Cristo. Y mi pregunta es, ¿cómo voy a llegar hasta allá? ¿Acaso me tengo que matar? Pues supuestamente este es el camino que me debe llevar para allá. Porque por aquí vine. Ok, ya encontré otro camino. Ay, está rara, me siento con el cabello lacio. well.
When I was originally thinking about how to write the music for the game, I suddenly realised that you don't see anybody in the game, and the most important character as such is the island itself. So one of the things that I did with the music was to write the island as if she or he were a character in its own right, and that's really important, I think, that you're going through this space and actually it's completely devoid of people, but the music in a way populates the island, and that the voice of the island speaks to you through the music.
Which is interesting, because I think that's really come on in terms of later games we've done, that sowed the seeds for the way in which we approach music in Rapture, where it was very specifically the voice of characters. And Machine for Pigs as well, where the music was about being Lily's voice in the game, Lily's representation in the game. So it's interesting how, looking back on Esther, a lot of those kind of ideas were tried out here that then came on to take other forms in stuff we've done since. Alright, let's talk about walking. Let's do it. We're going to address the elephant in the room, the very, very slow-moving elephant in the room. So this might be a longer conversation because it kind of fits with that. So Esther was the first of the what are now called walking simulators, and it was really interesting that for us it didn't feel that weird to have a game that was slower than normal, where actually there was lots of time to just walk around and think and look at things. And it was amazing at the time how this was seen as completely revolutionary, and it's really interesting, and it's amazing to see how many other games have kind of like taken it on board. For me, it came from, I didn't see it as being odd to have a game where very little happened, where you thought about what you were doing. For me, it was kind of interesting that you could play some of the best moments in Doom are the bits where nothing's happening and you're just doing it, or System Shock, or those games that I absolutely love. Those quiet moments were the really powerful ones. But Esther is definitely slower than a lot of games, and I think that's actually why it's lasted. I think if we did have moments where we went, should it be faster, should we put a sprint button in, but I'm so pleased that we kind of held our nerve and went, no, just as like in real life, I don't run everywhere because that would be weird. It's okay to have a game where you don't run everywhere, and actually it is a bit weird to run everywhere, but if you're going to do that, then you've got to support it in other ways, and I think the music was a really powerful way of supporting that change of pace.
What's really...
The radio mast in Dear Esther was obviously there as a really important kind of design feature, as well as its place within the story. And that, I think, came from, it was really interesting, it being a Half-Life mod to begin with, and the Citadel in Half-Life 2, that it tells you how far you are through the game. You're always looking up to the skyline, am I closer to the Citadel, can I see it? And it lets you know how near you are to the end of the game. And it was really important because Esther's so open in a way, and because there isn't this, you're not using kind of shootouts or kind of gating it with combat encounters to kind of constantly keep you moving. That it was really, really important that you always had that focal point of going, I know exactly from the beginning of the game, virtually right from the start, you know where you're going, you know where the game's going to end up, and you know that sooner or later you're going to be either at the base of that thing or climbing that thing, and it's always there, that red light. And I think particularly with the colour palette of the game, the fact that you've got this very, very, very clear red light that's unlike any of the other colours in the game immediately tells you as a player, this is what the shape of this thing is going to be, this is where I'm going, this gives me a purpose, even if the sort of moment by moment is a bit more abstract.
Yeah, and navigationally as well, it helps you, it draws you in the right direction as you play the game. You can never get lost if you just follow that one landmark.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting place of where that sort of traditional game design is still, there's loads of it in Esther, it's just...
So something you'll notice as you look around the environment is, from a distance you see the landscape, it's kind of a beautiful place in some ways, but something I wanted to bring to the game was that there's this second layer beneath the surface, whereas if you look at things closely, you see that the actual island itself is very polluted. It's kind of very rotten. Everywhere you look, every rock, every grass surface, it has this layer of filth on it, and it's kind of been put in there just to kind of emphasize further that this island's a really unpleasant place to live. It's like if you scratch the surface, you see like just how corrupt this island is.
We cast and did all the voice direction for Esther ourselves for the mod, and it was basically Jess and I on a casting website just listening to people's show reels and finding what's the voice of this thing. There was never any question about Nigel. I think we heard his show reel for the first time around. It's probably been listened to sort of 30 or 40 actors, and we started listening to his show reel and just both looked at each other and went, that's it, that's him. And it was amazing when Nigel came in. We had, I think, a day and a half to do the whole thing. And he just did that amazing thing that really, really great actors did. If he just walked in, got in front of the microphone, and more or less did the entire thing in one take. And we did hardly any retakes on anything. It just felt like his instinct for the character in the game was so strong that he just, without virtually any direction, just came in and just got it. And one of the hardest things with the voiceover that we did was when we went from the mod, which had 3 potential narrative units per cue, to 4 potential narrative units per cue, was not only finding new bits of writing that kind of complemented and played off what was there in the original mod, but for Nigel to come back in, nearly 5 years later, and to just re-find that voice in exactly the same way and deliver it in a way that fitted in and complemented it was a real testament to his ability as an actor, I think. That apart from we had spent quite a lot of time trying to make the sound actually sound the same in terms of mic placement and things like that, but in terms of the actual delivery of those new monologues, you wouldn't know that was both written and acted sort of 4.5 years after the original thing was done. So the one person who's not in the room sort of today but deserves a huge amount of credit for how the game kind of eventually was delivered, but also I think in terms of how the game has lasted, a huge amount of respect needs to go to Nigel Carrington for his work on it.
En serio que no me arrepiento de lograrlo. Me gusta el sonido.
So this hole in the ground was kind of a difficult thing in some ways. It's a bit of a challenging aspect of the game. Because, in some ways, it kind of like, I think for me, we wanted to have this kind of this pit here, and I wanted the player to be able to actually go as close as possible and like look over the edge and you know, kind of have this feeling of dread and stuff. But the other issue that we faced was like, what happens if the player just jumps into the hole? Like, yeah. we have no real death in the game, and from a design point of view, Dan, I mean, I don't know what you
it was really hard because you know, it was a game where we couldn't let the player die. We didn't want to have respawns, but we had to handle the fact that there would be both accidents where the player would fall off a cliff or something, but also the deliberate urge as a player. Yeah. You know, the first thing you're going to do is go, great, there's an ocean, how far out can I go? Or there's a cliff that's really high, can I jump off it? And how do you have death in a game where you can't have the player die? Because if the player starts breaking up the experience, loading, then you're in you start breaking the experience a lot. So
yeah, I mean, we didn't want to also have like artificial boundaries, you know, where it's like an invisible wall. Like if you take a look through the game, you'll never see a place where you think you can get to but you can't. There's always some kind of actual natural boundary or man-made boundary. So yeah, that was the other thing. We didn't really want to create this invisible wall around this thing. So
it kind of the whole drove the way in which that sort of the very weird audio visual, probably one of the most dreamlike bits in the game, where if you do die and you get the kind of the heartbeat and the strange flashes of visuals. And I think in a lot of ways, if we hadn't had the hole there and we hadn't had a place where we go, right, players will jump in this hole, we have to start from that basis, they will throw themselves down this hole, it kind of gave us the impetus to really, really focus on it. And I think the stuff like
one of the really important jobs of a composer, I think, is to provide the player or the listener with different emotional tones and states. And up until this point in the game, the music has been very sparse, very intimate, and very isolating in a way. But the island is also a beautiful and magnificent place, and what I wanted to do at this point for the first time in the game is to create something that was really epic. So we go from that shift in scale where it's very intimate and small to suddenly realising that this is an extraordinary and magical place to be, as well as a difficult and quite sad and melancholic place to be. So the string players were instructed at this point to play with much more vibrato. Up until this point they've played in a very sort of Scottish style, actually, no vibrato, very plain playing. But this was a really beautiful cue to write, actually, because that has that scale. You suddenly realise that the island is really big, and you know, you have this beautiful vista, and the music then shifts so the player can actually, just for a moment, I think, enjoy being where they are.
Yeah, I think that's it. Can I? Yeah, I was going to say, this is actually one of my favourite parts of the game. It's just where everything, all the elements kind of come together perfectly. You've got the music, which is just epic, as Jess has said. You've got the landscape, which is kind of like this big open space. You've got all the little bits and pieces that I put into the detail of the environment, like the movement. There's leaves blowing around, there's the clouds in the sky, there's the mist rising off of the grass, and then you've got Dan's voiceover coming in there. And I think it's just like all of these elements coming together and just in perfect synergy, and just kind of, it really brings chills up your spine.
Inside the bothy, there is a randomised chance that you can find an ultrasound picture on the table, and I think it's the one instance of randomisation in the game that is like the pinnacle of it, because the idea that Esther was pregnant when she died changes everything emotionally about how you understand the story. I'm not saying you don't care as much if you don't find it, but it just adds this other layer of just the ground falls away from him the first time I saw it, and the meaning of the crash in Esther's death just means so much more when you go, it's not just about her, there was an unborn child here. And I think that's where the randomisation just hits its absolute peak, because it's one tiny detail that may or may not be there, but if it's there, it's going to fundamentally change the way you feel about the entire thing. And that's the strength that the randomisation elements in Esther kind of provide, that you go, you're likely kind of feeling about the story and your understanding about the story. So as you leave the bothy and the seagull takes off, that's the one jump scare in the game, which is kind of interesting, because when we made it, we kind of had to, we kind of called it a ghost story, but there was no intention really. We kind of wanted this dreamy, hallucinatory type thing. But when it came out, people started coming back and saying, this game is absolutely terrifying. I was really, really frightened. And that was really amazing. And I think it's because nothing happens. We're so trained in games to go, there's stimulus all the time, that if nothing happens, you're waiting for something to happen. And kind of, I tend to go back to again and again the whole sequence in Dead Space 2 when you go back to the Ishimura, and it's like the best bit of Dead Space 2, because for what feels like hours, but it's probably only about 15 minutes, nothing happens and no necromorph comes at you, and it's absolutely terrifying because it's just this space and you're just left in it. So I think the kind of the bird here is really interesting because it can actually really, really make you jump. But I don't know if that was part of why people were saying that the game was really scary, but it was a real surprise when people started coming back and saying, this is a frightening game. And I don't know how much of that is to do with the ideas in the game are frightening when you think about them, and how much of it is to do with just the emptiness and the lack of kind of things in the game make it a really quite stressful or quite frightening place. But it was a real surprise, I think, that sort of reaction from a lot of players when we shipped it.
Que se luce un poquito más otra vez. Sí. Digo, lo que me tardé en hacerlo, ¿verdad? Que se luzca. Tengo que llegar allá abajo a eso.
So one of the things that influenced the visuals quite a lot was the tech limitations at the time, and also the kind of themes of the game. Like, tech-wise, we were never ever gonna kind of achieve photorealism, and I think that was a good thing. I mean, really, it made us sort of stretch out into other areas, and for me as an artist, it kind of made me think a little bit more creatively. I did a few tests at the beginning, and when I realized this wasn't possible, I kind of went back and I kind of did some research on different styles, and one of the ones that really struck me was this kind of impressionistic painterly style, where it's kind of like there's just enough shape and color there for you to form an image, but a lot of it is just your imagination. It's kind of like the believability of the environment is in your mind. So this is something that I really wanted to bring over into the game, and you'll see a lot of landscapes that kind of look very surreal, very kind of unreal, and that's mainly due to this impressionistic style.
we should probably talk about some of the inspirations behind it. I'm on a strict you don't talk about stalker kind of thing going on here. But when Rob and I started talking, I think one of the first things that we kind of discovered was how much we're both obsessed with stalker. And I think that was one of the major things behind it in terms of when people talk about game inspirations. I mean, for me, there's a lot of FPS stuff in there, Doom, System Shock, but I think Stalker probably more than anything else. And Roadside Picnic, the Strugatsky novel that Stalker's based on, of the idea of this incredible space that you didn't understand, that's simultaneously beautiful and threatening. And I think sort of Tarkovsky's kind of films kind of play into that as well, particularly his version of Stalker, that you want to have this place that you feel rather than think about. And for me, that was like really kind of core to all of the inspirations for the game, was this is a space that is about feeling, not thinking.
Yeah, I think the movies in particular, I think I hadn't watched the movies. I'd read the book and I played the game, but when I watched the movie, it kind of all made sense to me, like why I like the game so much and why I like the story. It's just like every shot is like a painting. It's like every shot has its story to tell. There's very little dialogue in the actual movie itself. There's just these long, lingering shots, and each shot is amazingly beautiful, and in its kind of desolation. And for me, that was like a huge influence, you know, like trying to bring some of that through into the environments. So that is definitely something I'm going to struggle not to talk about. But the game as well. I'd say the actual Stalker game has a big place in my heart. Like gaming-wise, it's one of the reasons I got into game art in the first place.
Yeah.
So that to me is a big part of it too. One of the more interesting and challenging things to do in the visual side of things is to kind of create an emotional connection with the player. With the music, it's very strong, and the dialogue can kind of help you to feel what the character's feeling, but to kind of really create an atmosphere and to create emotion, it's very difficult. So I designed a few things very subtly within the environment to kind of plant imagery into your mind and kind of make you feel certain things. With this shipwreck on the beach, you can kind of, like, if you look at it from certain angles, you get this real, like it's like a cross sticking up. It's this kind of semi-religious imagery, but it really kind of, it's not obvious, it's not in your face, it's just kind of like something that makes you feel like something you know. And so like there's a lot of deliberate attempts in the game to recreate that feeling, and it's kind of hard to point out in many other places, but it's done in a way where every single rock, every single plant, every single cliff face has been deliberately placed and designed in a way to try and make you feel something in the game.
One of the really important images in the game is the radio mast, and the soundscapes that I wrote for the game are really tied into this idea. So it's the concept of the tortured sounds that they're so broken down, they're so manipulated, and it really is supposed to represent the inner state of the protagonist at this point. It's that fractured understanding. So it kind of works on two levels, actually. We have the narrator who's trying to understand the journey that he's on, and we also have the audience's journey and their struggle for comprehension to understand what's going on in the game. So this distortion, this breaking down, this fragmented, kind of tortured sound really ties into the idea of the radio mast and that idea of communication, actually, that the game is trying to communicate something to you, the narrator's trying to tell you something, but it's so difficult to understand what that is.
Sorry, pensé que me... no se preocupe, Felipe. Ahorita estoy todavía con lo de la historia y nada más que fui a ver porque parecía que alguien... ¡Y caigo al hoyo! O sea que cada que me mato me van a dar un trofeo. No se preocupe, Felipe, todo está bien. Sí, algo por el estilo. Que ya ahora sí ya voy a poder empezar a jugar o todavía no. Y llevamos casi la hora y no... Santo Cristo.
The caves in the game are really interesting because it's a very tonal shift within the whole visual look of the game. It's kind of like this more organic, more surreal, dreamlike landscape compared to what you're used to before this point. It's we kind of used the visuals and this kind of unreal theme very subtly, but here it's kind of at the forefront. And it's, to me, has kind of been designed as this kind of journey through the inner self, through the body, and it's really designed to be a very different experience compared to the rest of the game.
Ella es Cindy, la mujer favorita. Y la Michi por ahí anda abajo. Aquí acomodándome los cascos porque la niña me los movió. Sorry. Primero muerta que sencilla.
This, for me, is probably the most pivotal music cue in the game, and it's the one that most people write to me about to say that they are absolutely obsessed with and they love.
Es una PUC.
It's the only music cue that has singing. It has a female voice. I think that's a really important shift for me. That you've gone from this beautiful string music, but it's quite abstract, into what is effectively a song. And with lyrics, so you're actually explicitly saying something as a composer at this point. The other thing that I think it's important to say for me is it's the biggest shift from the music that I wrote for the mod. It's the same music, but the act of having it sung by an amazing singer. I sang it on the original and it's really bad, and Clara Sanabras re-recorded it, and it's what good actors do, it's what Nigel Carrington did, it's what good musicians do, and they take something that you've created and they just shove it up into the next level and make something that's good into something really extraordinary. And also for me, I think it's a point where the environment art and the music just meld so beautifully and so seamlessly into one. I mean, on a personal level, I've played the game hundreds of times now, and I still enter the caves and I look at Rob's work and I'm just absolutely overawed, just gobsmacked by its beauty. And I just think it's a really magical moment in gaming for me, actually. I know that probably sounds really dramatic, but I just think it absolutely hits something where everything just works together. And the music is so dreamlike. You know, Rob has talked about the journey through the body, and I think that's absolutely, for me, the music becomes so organic and fluid and actually very feminine and female at that point. You're hearing the voice of his love. This, for me, is probably the most pivotal music cue in the game, and it's the one that most people write to me about to say that they are absolutely obsessed with and they love. It's the only music cue that has singing, it has a female voice, and I think that's a really important shift for me, that you've gone from this beautiful string music, but it's quite abstract, into what is effectively a song, and with lyrics, so you're actually explicitly saying something as a composer at this point. The other thing that I think it's important to say for me is it's the biggest shift from the music that I wrote for the mod. It's the same music, but the act of having it sung by an amazing singer. I sang it on the original.
The caves in the game are really interesting because it's a very tonal shift within the whole visual look of the game. It's kind of like this more organic, more surreal, dreamlike landscape compared to what you're used to before this point. It's we kind of used the visuals and this kind of unreal theme very subtly, but here it's kind of at the forefront, and it's, to me, has kind of been designed as this kind of journey through the inner self, through the body, and it's really designed to be a very different experience compared to the rest of the game.
Espero que estén entendiendo el juego. Y vamos a ver.
This for me is probably the most pivotal music cue in the game, and it's the one that most people write to me about to say that they are absolutely obsessed with and they love. It's the only music cue that has singing, it has a female voice, and I think that's a really important shift for me, that you've gone from this beautiful string music, but it's quite abstract, into what is effectively a song, and with lyrics, so you're actually explicitly saying something as a composer at this point. The other thing that I think it's important to say for me is it's the biggest shift from the music that I wrote for the mod. It's the same music, but the act of having it sung by an amazing singer. I sang it on the original and it's really bad, and Clara Sanabras re-recorded it, and it's what good actors do, it's what Nigel Carrington did, it's what good musicians do, and they take something that you've created and they just shove it up into the next level and make something that's good into something really extraordinary. And also for me, I think it's a point where the environment art and the music just meld so beautifully and so seamlessly.
I just want to say that I think you can divide caves in games into pre and post Dear Esther. I think that it's just a way of breaking away from reality into saying what you can do with these spaces that actually makes them this incredibly, much more vividly colourful and much more kind of interpretative and look for it. And it's really interesting that I look at caves now in games and I find myself going, that's a very Rob Briscoe cave. I think that's an amazing thing to have achieved. So I think it's one of those. It's great paying other people's work compliments. I enjoy that because you never feel like you're being big-headed about yourself. But I think it is. I think particularly it does come again down to that blend between the audio and visuals that just. It's a real high watermark. I kind of. It's one of the areas in all of the games. I think when you're designing a game, it's very easy to get very locked into what the system can do. And you're trying to deal with all the different variations of things, that if a player does this, then this. And we have to deal with the consequence here. And our lead designer, Andrew, and I talk about this all the time, about you might have an idea, but then how does this radiate out throughout the entire system? And you get very caught in the idea of what the system has to be and how robust the system has to be and this kind of thing. And I think what's really important as a sort of a designer, as a creative, is that understanding that actually the real game is happening in the player's head, and that the system can be whatever you want it to be, but if the game isn't running in the player's head as opposed to on the screen, then you're missing a trick. You're not letting the game be everything it could be. And I think the great thing about working with a game as simple as Esther in a way is that those sort of consequences of player interaction, there's not a huge number of them in the way that there might be with a very mechanically complex game. So you can really heavily focus on what is the game experience that's being played out within the player's sort of mind and heart at the moment. And there are other, I know this is a kind of a way of approaching game design that has become increasingly popular over. What's really important to me is that Dear Esther started out as a Half-Life 2 mod, And if the Half-Life 2 modding community hadn't championed it and celebrated it and downloaded it a lot and talked about it and loved it, then it would never have been a game. So it's never really bothered me, the kind of is it a game conversation, because as far as I can see it, Dear Esther and like everything that's come after it that's been inspired by it, this was championed by Half-Life 2 modders, and they made it what it is. And
Dear Esther was my first foray into writing music for games, and I actually approached it very traditionally, so more as a film score than a traditional interactive game music score. And what's really interesting for me is that the lack of interactivity in the music was never a problem for anybody that played the game. And that's a separate discussion, but there's a big schism between game music composers of how much the music should be following the player at all times in terms of interactive music. But one of the reasons I wanted to say something at this point was that this was my little first journey into thinking about how you write music for games rather than films. So I had this song that was a certain length, and Dan said, well, we don't know how long the player is going to take to traverse through that space. And I thought, oh no, he's right, and slightly panicked. So this was a very simple solution where the song was split in half, and then I wrote some drone music that could just play for as long as was needed as the player walked through the space, and then the second half of the song would seamlessly play. And it's very, very simple, but it's quite emblematic for me in terms of my career, because it was the first time that I had to think about the player. Because with film music it's so simple, you know exactly what's going to happen when, but this concept of interactivity was so new for me, so I kind of look back at it fondly because it's quite a basic approach to, compared to something like everybody's.
I don't know when the paper origami boats first came into things with Esther, really, but it felt like a really amazing metaphor of taking these letters and folding them into boats and then letting them leave the island, because you at this point in the game is kind of the realisation is there that this isn't going to end well, and that the narrator is never leaving the island, and the idea that this kind of, again, the idea of communication, or the attempt or failing communication, or trying to speak through the coma, or whatever it is, however you want to interpret it, but the idea of putting the boat in the underground river really felt like it kind of reinforced that sort of dream-like kind of. In a lot of ways, the caves were the hardest area of the game to actually write, because we knew we didn't want to have much voiceover in there. I think because of the strength of the music, and this goes right back to the original mod, we wanted that to be the voice and for it to be a chance for Esther to speak rather than the narrator. And we also wanted to have this break, so when the narrator came out from the caves, you had a real definite sense of something happening, and that he had changed as a result of this journey. So it meant really felt wrong to have a lot of voiceover within there, but then that made it really difficult, because then you had like 4 one-sentence lines in there, and each one of those had to have an absolute clarity and to really, really kind of work. So I think for me, it was really interesting. It's like the difference between writing kind of fiction and writing poetry. When you read really amazing poets and you have that incredible surgical precision where every single word is considered and placed so absolutely, and rather than being able to kind of, because the narrator rambles quite naturally, you could kind of get into the flow of the narrator's ramble in other places in the level, and this was a real challenge, because suddenly I was having to write like a poet, of going every single one of these words, every single cadence, every single sound.
The sound here is a classic case of, again, what music I think does really well, which is you've had this soft, lyrical, beautiful, epic, dreamlike music, and then the moment you come out of the caves, you're into this really harsh soundscape, and the tonal shift is very, very brutal, I think, and deliberately so. You have very little music when you come out of the caves. You hear the wind, and it's a classic case of foreshadowing. So we know from this point that things are probably going to get bleaker, more difficult. And yeah, it's something that music does really well, I think, which is that emotional signalling and signposting.
Hola, veo aquí el sí. Sí, estoy probando a ver qué es lo que suele. Hola, Escorpio León, ¿cómo está? Sí, estoy ahorita con el tutorial, pero no me lleva a ningún lado. Ah, ok. Lo que pasa es de que es la introducción de cómo fue que sacaron las ideas, la música, el tema y todo eso. Por eso están hablando. Ya espero encontrar el...
This whole area moved, didn't it? The original mod, this was a cave right at the beginning of the caves where everything was written, and it moved to the back end of the level, and we have this long corridor that's full of these kind of... It's the point of high madness, I think, in the game, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of just where you feel like you're losing the plot completely, both like visually and auditory, and you know, it's kind of like this really frenetic moment for me.
I think it's where you feel most that you're underneath a mountain.
¿Ya lo has
you feel
jugado?
the weight of that mountain, and just the... I loved the idea when we were, you know, putting through it of what would it actually take to do this, like to actually paint all these symbols and what is going on. It really is quite an explicit kind of thing of madness of going, you would have to be insane or very, very disturbed to actually do this, and what is the process that this person's trying to work through, what they trying to achieve by this. And I think it really strengthened it, making it a crawl through a tunnel as opposed to just a static location.
Yeah, I think it's the consistency and the coherence of the symbols is a lot more broken down as well. Like you see some symbols before like scattered around the environments, but at this point they're like right in your face, and they're kind of...
This is a bit more of a contentious one because we disagree on this one. I struggle with this. With the points in the caves where you duck above and below the water, and you have to have that transition of audio. And I love the audio on both sides of the surface tension of the water, but I really struggle with you breaking water because it's such a hard edge to the sound, and I don't think there's any other way around that. And you need to have those moments where you do go underwater because it's so important. But it's one of the areas that's never sat very comfortably with me, because I feel like in a level which hasn't got a single edge in it, it's the one edge within it, and it breaks me.
And that's why I think it's so successful, because you've been lured into this completely hallucinatory, dreamlike world, and then all of a sudden, as a player, you're literally gasping for breath. You're coming up for air. And I think when we're talking about that metaphor of the body, for me, it's so about birth, and it's about this coming through the water, and actually it's a moment of realisation for me, but you're having to go back under again, and you're diving down. So for me, without wanting to sound incredibly pretentious, it's about the fight between the conscious and the subconscious, and that struggle. Booyah!
There's actually a really interesting thing about that underwater section there, though, is that, I don't know if you remember, but you had a certain piece of music that plays when you're underwater, and to me, I really like that. It's kind of like because at this point it's kind of like a very calm, relaxed type of a journey, and you go underwater and it starts to break apart a little bit.
Lo que pasa es de que
that kind of
yo no sabía de cómo era,
it's not complete
y por eso lo puse así.
And it helps to build the
pero pues ya quiero que se termine todo eso, pues para poderme a jugar.
Yeah. Excellent. That's good. That's the way it should be.
Pues yo entiendo inglés y sabe lo que está diciendo. Hola, yo. ¡Woo! Perdón. Ay.
The motorway scene. The biggest new addition to between the mod and the commercial version. This didn't exist in the mod at all. It was a completely new thing.
Dios, estamos bajo el mar ahora.
I wasn't sure where the ideas spawned from.
Lo que me gusta es de que estoy viendo que decisiones que tomes te vas a tener consecuencias.
Yeah, it was just
hey, hola, señor Lázaro, ¿cómo está?
Gracias
por pasar.
Between the drop and then coming out at the end part. but it was
Aquí
like
probando
it
el
was the
nuevo
same
juego
thing that we
de Dear
dealt with
Esther.
in the past of like, how do we not kill the player? From a technical standpoint, I think it might have been something to do that, but it was also, you know, I can't remember where the whole thing came from.
I think it's my favourite point in the whole game, actually. I think it's just it's quite shocking, and it's so surreal, and it's so beautiful. And from an audio point of view, you have that baby's heartbeat bringing us back to the idea of the ultrasound. Was Esther pregnant? And it's one of those moments that I think everything just kind of collates together, and it's so unexpected.
Yeah, for me, it's like a moment of realization.
So the admission really is that I did play fast and loose with the geography of the M5. There isn't actually a welcome break service. It's just outside the junction of Sanford. But we also know players. I mean, what a thing if you make something that's based vaguely on somewhere in real life. In terms of a compliment, when you're getting emails from players going, there isn't a welcome break there, and people really trying to work out where is this, and whole threads about where on the M5 it is. That's just the most amazing feeling. But I think what I think works really, really well in Esther, and again, it's something that I think is really carried forward to our other games, is that a lot of the time we're not dealing with kind of like big, glamorous, amazing, epic places. It's a sort of like a ratty little island in the Hebrides. It's someone who lived in Wolverhampton. It's just outside, you know, a service station on a stretch of the M5. And I think that earths what's going on, gives it a realness as well, particularly when you sort of put it against the
no se preocupe, yo también.
caves. Actually, kind of going,
Lo que
this is really
pasa
surreal
es
and this
de
is really
que,
dreamlike, but actually I'm talking about, you know, a
pues
car
como le
accident
digo,
just
así fue
outside Little
como
Chef,
lo
and it
puse,
kind
pero
of that playing off those two things against each other.
It's like making the ordinary extraordinary.
Pero ya
Absolutely,
quiero que
yeah.
se termine esto. Ni puse atención lo que estaban diciendo por estar hablando por teléfono. Desde que dijeron. ¿Qué dijeron? ¿Qué dijeron en... Ok. Ya era hora. Era frappé, pero ya se terminó. ¿En serio? ¿La pongo otra vez?
This scene for me is like really, really iconic because it kind of brings this idea of the caves being an inward journey through the body together. It's really kind of like a symbol of rebirth. And it actually brings together a lot of the visual goals that I wanted to achieve with a lot of the symbolism in the game. Like, I've talked a little bit about how the environment was kind of designed to provoke emotions, and kind of the impressionistic style gives you just enough information to make you think of things and feel things. But this is probably like the antithesis of this, and the whole feeling of rebirth here is quite strong. I know Jess.
Yeah, the music's really supporting that.
Yeah,
because she sings always, always throughout. You know, we've got always, always, and then she sings never, and a moment of absolute soaring. It's the climax of the music.
As you come out of the water and the music kind of swells, and you just kind of, it is like a moment of change has happened in some way, and I
think it's rebirth, isn't it? For me, it's his moment of clarity and acceptance and understanding of the reality of what's happened.
And you're literally moving towards the light at the end of the tunnel. You're actually doing that as you go through.
But the music, especially, I think before the music got layered in, that scene was nowhere near as kind of powerful for me. Like, that kind of just totally made it.
Sí, prometo, prometo, prometo. Ya, ya al parecer ya terminó. No, no ha terminado. Hola, señor Pipe, ¿cómo está? Se dice, Lázaro, ¿ya te juites? ¿Qué dice, señor Level? ¿Le pongo para que hablen o le saco la vuelta? Usted dice. Voy a esperar a ver qué me contesta. Bien, bien, gracias, aquí jugando a Dear Esther. Me alegra que esté bien, señor Pipe. Ok. Tengo que ponerlo porque es parte del tutorial.
Dan and I had worked on lots of projects together, non-game projects, before we made Dear Esther. And I think the thing that links all of the projects that we've worked on together is that idea of hidden stories and layers of stories. And one of the things I wanted to do with the music was to embed hidden little hints and stories into it. So the music that you hear here has Morse code, and the Morse code is spelling out the word Esther. And I really, really liked this concept of that some people would understand that it was Morse code and try and figure out what it was saying. It also provided a really interesting rhythmical dynamic. And yeah, it's just about these ideas of hidden stories and layers, but it also starts to emphasise the obsessional nature, I think, of the story in Dear Esther, and his agitation and actually slight panic. So you're getting this rhythm that just repeats and repeats and repeats obsessively. So I think even if you don't understand that it's saying Esther, and even if you don't understand that it's Morse code, you're still getting this feeling of this obsessional repetition and slight panic that he has. And again, it's kind of it's the new chapter, and it's spelling out that something has changed at this point. I've been on holiday to Greece lots of times, and one of the things that I always really responded to emotionally was those shrines that you see on the road, and sometimes they're dedicated to saints, and sometimes they're to markate where an accident has taken place. So you'll get photos of the deceased person and flowers and candles, and they'd always really touched me. And so I said to Rob, I think it would be amazing to get these into the game somehow, and then Rob took that idea and ran with it, and I think they're so successful and they're so beautiful and they're really moving. And I think it's because you had this elemental scale, you have the island, and it's huge, and you have that scale, and all of a sudden you come around this corner and it's absolutely brought back.
One of the really nice things about the move from mod to the commercial version is that we had a couple of years worth of the community talking about the game before we went back into it again. And one of the things that I read on a forum was that someone had constructed this amazing version of the story where they'd decided that the narrator was Paul. And I hadn't thought of that. It was never part of the original writing. And I thought, that's so amazing that as a writer, your audience can find something in what you're doing that you hadn't thought of. So it was really important when we went back in to record the additional set of voiceovers. I thought, I absolutely want to do this. I want to take this idea that's come out of the fans and to run with this and to add an entire new sort of stream of story in there. So we added in a couple of cues within the force level that intimated much more strongly that actually Paul wasn't this other character who caused the accident, but actually you were responsible for everything. But again, it was then trying to find that balance of not overcooking it, so you weren't led to that idea, but just if you happen to have the combination of just a couple of narrative units, then you would possibly come to that interpretation. But it was really amazing to be able to say, it felt like giving something back to the fans that had enabled us to make the remake in the first place. And it's always a lovely moment as a developer to be able to recognise your fan community and kind of say, thanks, this one's yours, this one's here for you.
Hasta parece de esos... ¿cómo se llaman? Ay, esas... de la tabla periódica. Ay, en este momento se me fue la idea. Bueno, me están saliendo letritas, quiere decir que vamos por buen camino. Nope. Lo tiene que comprar, señor Pipe.
What's fascinating to me, Dan, is that you're an atheist, but each of the 3 games that we've made are so strongly about religion.
De hecho, tengo entendido que salió el año pasado como en septiembre.
Why are you so drawn to it?
O algo así.
I think I'm really interested in people and the stories that make up people. And I think there is like in the Bible, like most kind of religious texts, it's not about what it is, it's about what is behind what it is, and that's what you're really getting to, is the idea of the sort of the parable or the metaphor.
32.
And it really felt like, particularly with Paul on the road to Damascus, is a story that many people know and we can understand, and it's about
bueno, de hecho, no fue mi error.
Así es como empieza el juego. Transformation and who you really are and what that means. And it felt like just a really strong, powerful way of making it very accessible, the narrator's kind of inner turmoil, in a kind of a story that we know really well. And there's a universality to those kind of questions that, whether it's, Christianity, whether it's Islam, whether it's kind of Buddhism, that they're asking very broadly similar questions. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a good person? How should we behave to each other? How should we feel about the world we're in? And it's a really powerful way of speaking to a lot of people. I think that's always been really important as well, is that it's about saying no matter who you are or what your kind of like outlook on life is, whether that's faith-based or secular, that we are all effectively asking the same questions, and that's why I think all our games kind of tend to be around those questions.
Y es Dios porque flota. Ah, no. Creo que no flotó mucho. Ay, Dios santo.
Come back.
Ay. Uh-huh.
Is Dear Esther a depressing game or a hopeful game?
For me, it's kind of like a mix of both, really. I think, like, my interpretation is kind of like, I always feel like kind of depressed when I think about the kind of turmoil that this guy's been going through. God knows how long, and the kind of environment he's been in, and all these events surrounding his story. But for me, I always feel like a little bit hopeful at the end. The conclusion just feels like a relief, and like this is kind of all ended in some way. What do you think, Jess?
I think it's a game about acceptance, and I really like that. And I think it's telling that a lot of people with mental health issues have responded really positively to the game, and then we get a lot of emails and letters from those people saying that it's helped them through a really difficult time. And for me, that's because
y terminó toda la historia, y ya cuando esté el juego en sí, ya lo pongo. Hola, Panda, ¿cómo está?
And that the pain is part of life, and that's a really beautiful message, and I think that's what you do so well.
No,
that's
para
what you
nada,
write
Panda.
about. You write about what it is to be human. So Dan, you wrote it.
Without wanting to cop out, one of the things about writing it that I really wanted to do was to make something that people could take and could own, and it would be their take on it. And their interpretation of it mattered in a way that mine didn't. My job was to give them the architecture to interpret in their way. So
I think that is a cop-out. I do. I think as a writer you always have.
Yeah, I think it's redemptive.
Es lo que le digo, yo creo que voy a cortar el directo, voy a terminarlo, el tutorial, y así ya cuando esté el juego bien,
I think the redemption of it, of saying that
lo juego.
This
things are never
too shall
easy.
pass.
This too shall pass.
Which my mum
yeah.
always says, you know, and I think that's probably the motto of the Chinese room.
Yeah,
actually,
Ok,
isn't it?
panda.
Like, I don't think
Provecho.
it's as
Coma por mí porque
kind of openly
estoy
positive
a
as say
dieta.
Rapture had a much more strongly positive end. I don't think Esther has. I think it's much grayer than that. But I think fundamentally it's about coming to terms.
No, es que no nada más usted, señor Level Kill. También ya a mí me fastidió de que yo lo que quiero es jugar. Yo ya quiero ver qué es todo eso, encontrar las cosas y así. Y la verdad, estar escuchando que están hable y hable y hable, sí cansa. No nada más a ustedes, también a mí. Entonces, pues prefiero terminar la historia y pues ya. Ouch, me pegué. Y así ya empieza bien, bien, bien. Así que pues muchas gracias a los que estuvieron conmigo en el directo. Vamos a empezar a dar agradecimientos porque ya llevamos 1 hora y para estar escuchando a los creadores pues como que cansa. Pues empezamos con Felipe Estrocito. Lucas Felipe también. Señor Level Kill 32, muchas gracias. Por si no conocen su canal, tiene juegos diferentes a los míos. Tiene un muy buen canal. Está también Scorpio León, que también es otro youtuber que tiene un canal, va empezando igual que yo. Señor Lázaro 7X también, muchas gracias por haber estado aquí. Y también él es youtuber, tiene un canal. El señor Pipe, muchas gracias por haber estado aquí. Y como tengo prendido el abanico, no crean que es parte de la ambientación del juego que está haciendo el aire, no. Y como que me está dando alergia, por eso estoy hablando así. Pues muchas gracias a Panda, da Panda acá, también muchas gracias por haber estado. Así que pues muchas gracias. Cuídense mucho y la vida continúa. Nunca te quedes estancada ni estancado por nada ni por nadie. Primero eres tú, o sea, más bien dicho, primero soy yo y después los demás. Así es lo que deben de hacer ustedes. Primero son ustedes y luego los demás. Así que no se ahoguen en un vaso con agua. Muy bien. Cuídense mucho, les mando muchas bendiciones y un gran corazón. Y pues nos vemos en la próxima. Y si les gusta, pues qué bueno que les haya gustado el contenido. Y espero que el próximo juego, ahora sí que sea juego, ya sea historia y no tanto cuento. Muchas gracias por haber estado aquí. Bendiciones, bye.